to S. Okay, so the curve of the ruler is touching for a few inches at S and then hitting at X. And I'm going to blend that curve. So it's an almost indistinguishable curve, but it's there. And I'm putting the curvier part of the ruler near the elbow because that's where the bending happens. I'm having it more or less straight at the wrist because nothing's bending here. Okay? So this is just blended in a gentle curve, and the sleeve is done. Okay, so we need to add seam allowance. Don't walk away yet. We need to add seam allowance. How much seam allowance should we add?
Half inch.
I'm going to add 1/2 inch everywhere. I'm going to, except for the hem, I'm going to add 1 inch. Now, I'm going to show you something about adding seam allowance. We didn't do it on our last patterns because we're ending up cutting off this seam allowance anyway. All this lovely seam allowance we're adding is going to be going away this afternoon. But we needed the seam allowance for our fit sample, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, 1/2 inch all the way around. The cap is going to take a whole lot of pivot mark stuff going on. I can't add seam allowance fully here until I know the shape of my dart intake. Now this is tricky. I don't have a center front or a center back on my sleeve. What direction should I fold my dart?
Down.
We're going to fold it down. Reason being, imagine putting your hand through this sleeve. If that dart allowance was poking up your fingers, we get caught in it every single time you put your sleeve in. Okay? So every time we have a horizontal dart, we're going to press it towards the waist. So in our case, my elbow is above my waist. That dart is going to get pressed down towards the waist. If for whatever reason I had some sort of darts on the bottom, which I have yet to see a lot of, I would press those up. Okay, so our rule for vertical darts is they get pressed towards center. Our rule for horizontal darts coming from the side seam, is they're going to get pressed towards the waist. We are going to have some darts sometime on the bodice. Those would get pressed towards the waist. Okay, so I'm going to fold this the correct direction so that allowance is downwards. This will also help me double check that my dart legs are the same length. If they're not the same length, blend them out. You can even use a little curve so you don't have a corner in there, right? Okay, and then with it shut, tape it, pin it, hold it tightly. With it shut, you'll cut your seam allowance. Okay, now with the hem. If I took this and just extended my seam allowance downward into this hem, do you see how the hem allowance just keeps getting narrower and narrower and narrower?
Mm-hmm.
If I had a 2 or 3 inch hem, it would get really narrow at the bottom. If I had a 2 or 3 inch hem, and you might want to do that sometime for decorative purposes, if I folded that up for the hem, that hem would then be much narrower than the sleeve, and if I tried to sew that hem, it would be really hard to do. So we're going to start getting into the practice of thinking about what direction our allowances are going to be pressed before we cut them out. So if I know this hem is eventually going to get pressed upwards, right? If I know that's getting pressed upwards, I'm actually going to fold it upwards before I cut these side lines. So see what happens. If I have this folded up and I now cut along these seam allowances, you see this little triangle that happened down here? That's a good thing. That's just like getting this bizarre little triangle within my dart. I want these strange little triangles that happen when you fold hems or seams the correct direction. Now on our basic block where we squared off all those little intersections, this folding, if it's truly squared, would result in absolutely nothing. But I don't have a squared line here, I have an angle. So it's producing an angle down here. So if there's ever a place where you for whatever reason, you don't have a squared line at that intersection, fold the seam allowance in the direction you want it to go, and then lop it off. Okay? Even in our back neck, yes, I squared, right? And we can kind of visually see this maybe. But I didn't square for a full inch. So if I fold my seam allowance back, do you see how there's a gap there? Right?
Yeah.
I should have folded my paper and then cut my neckline, and that would eliminate this gap. I didn't have you do this yet because you guys were already a little bit overwhelmed, right? But now you're ready for this information. If I have a little teeny tiny 1/4 inch seam allowance and it's not quite meeting the neck here, I might run the risk of that seam allowance not getting caught in the collar seam or the facing seam or whatever. So we're going to start practicing folding our seam allowances before we cut, and especially our hem allowances like this where there's something really angled. Okay? What are we going to do with this? We're going to cut 2 of them out of muslin. You can go ahead and cut 1 today so we can do a test fit. But if you're confident and things came together well and it made sense to you, go ahead and cut 2, you know. And same thing, we're going to draw in the center line. Let's draw in the bicep line. I don't necessarily need the elbow line, but it's helpful to see bicep line, center line. We also need to locate our shoulder on this sleeve. Our shoulder seam may or may not line up with the center line here. My little example here shows my notches that say, hey, this is the back, hey, this is the front. I have another notch up here that indicates where your sleeve hits your shoulder line. And you remember how we added some ease to our sleeve that our armhole doesn't have? We added a 1/4. What really ended up happening when we added these curves is it gave us more than that 1/4. Our goal here is to have 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 extra ease in this whole cap. How are we going to figure out how much ease we have here?
You said 1 1/2 too.
We need 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 extra room up here. How are we going to find out how much ease we really have? Measure it. Okay, so I could either take my pattern pieces and go to a light box because I still have seam allowance on here, and I could do something called walking it. I could put my piece here and I could match up the lines. I wouldn't have to measure that way, right? I could just match up my line to my line, or I can absolutely measure it. I know what my measurements are, so it's not the end of the world, right? So my back measurement was 8 7/8, so I'm going to find where that hits on my sleeve. Oops, sorry. So mine's really close to A up here. Or 8 7/16. Sorry, guys. Not 8 7/8. This is one of those times you want to measure a couple times just to make sure. That's more like it. Okay, so this is where my back armhole would walk to. We're going to put a mark. My front armhole. Make sure I got this right. Oh, it's that way around. Front is that. Back is that. 7, 6, 5, 3. Here it is. So there's where my back would walk to. My front